Hang on a moment. This is about to play a key part in what we're going to be looking at. So, chapter 2, Christianity or nationalism. Nationalism. So this is Stanley's second chapter, in which he explores the degree to which Christianity should be something that opposes nationalism or something that could work with nationalism, and how we feel about it. I think it might be one of the essay questions, because this is one of the chapters that I got rather sort of interested about. So in 1910, Irish Catholic Church, previously very inward-looking, suddenly begins producing clergy and nuns and for mission abroad, says Diarmaid MacCulloch. And the Pope, Benedict XV, gives this encouragement to foreign missionaries to appoint indigenous bishops for China and Japan. So that's very exciting, slightly, in my view, contrasting with what had been previously given the advice of Francis Xavier, who'd done an amazing job in the evangelism, I think it was Japan, and done a terrific job until the Pope came to sort of do an Ofsted inspection on it, and didn't like what he saw. But this call to have indigenous ministry happening seems to be something that that the Pope here is picking up on, and how terribly important it is. For a church to thrive, it needs its indigenous leaders. We need them to be proclaiming the gospel afresh in their language, in their culture, in their setting, which they will know far better than us as we move into it. It's kind of why we need to employ youth workers, because I no longer speak youth anymore, for example. But that's a red herring. I'd like you to, think in terms of Vincent Donovan and Christianity Rediscovered, his work amongst the Maasai, and how they come to work out, well, what are the core elements, the fundamentals, that we need to be having and working through. Nations have worked out how they go about forming their sense of identity. When you were doing a Reformation with Moira, I presume you weren't really doing much in terms of a nation identity. There isn't really a sense of Germany as Luther comes. There's all these little states and fiefdoms. So there isn't this sense of Germany and so on. But as we see the turn into the 20th century, we certainly see this rise of nationalism coming forward. And so in Russia, for example, one approach there is to be against everything, anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and that's how we know who we are, because we're against whatever it is the West is for. We're against it, and very much anti-Christian. We'll come to that in a later chapter. Whereas in India, what we see is a different approach, a mixing of things, mixing Western political traditions with the Hindu Vedic traditions, like the Bhagavad Gita, bringing that in. So you've got Gandhi and how he pulls in Tolstoy and Christ, whilst bringing in and remaining quite distinctly Hindu in his own approach. The two nations that we're going to particularly focus on here are Korea and Poland. Those of you who thought, 20th century Christianity, that's really exciting, because that'll all be about Church of England and what's happened in it. No, it isn't. One of the books I think I showed you was, and that's, anyway, just boring. I'm sure it isn't, but I wanted us to look more globally, more at what the rest of Christendom is doing across our planet rather than just England. So we're going to look at Korea, for example, and we're going to see how we move from a post-war 1920s Christianity, something to be thrown off in most of Asia, and then by the 1960s we have Korea becoming simply the most Christian nation in Asia, and I think it probably still is. Really, it's tremendous, the stuff that's there, the mega churches that are there, Yonggi-cho and all that sort of stuff. The key element here in Korea is this sense of in the course of this 20th century, Korean nationalism and evangelical Christianity forged an increasingly stable reliance. page 14. And they did it in two ways, says Stanley. They did it firstly in terms of language and how the Protestant missionaries supported the Korean language over the imposition of I get a little bit confused with some of this because you've got the Chinese characters being used, and you've got a Japanese protectorate that comes over in 1905. But through all this, you've got the Protestants pushing a Korean dialect, Hangul, and pushing their New Testament in this language, and that in its own way drew people and grew the church in that way. So part one through language, part two through indigenous pastors. And so something that these Korean missionaries seem to be very good at was quite quickly handing over power and mission to the indigenous Koreans in that approach, and so giving them responsibility. So we see the church continues to grow in this way. Interesting challenge in Caesar as Lord, something that the early church struggled a lot with. St. Paul writes about this, and the martyrdom of Polycarp picks up on this as well. And here you've got an equivalent, the Shinto ceremonies required to show your loyalty to the Japanese emperor. The Vatican says it's okay in 1936, and the Protestants say it's okay in 1938. But even still, you've got this sort of, oh, I don't know, is this okay for me to be doing? So even when the 1945 authorities, they closed 200 churches, you've got 50 Christians who died in prison, and so they become martyrs. So you've got to be careful here. You don't want to create martyrs where you don't need martyrs. The partition in 1945, suddenly coming out of the blue, northern part of Korea, this becomes Soviet control. Southern part of Korea, this becomes American control. Stanley says 60% of the Christians were in the north. Suddenly they find themselves very much in an enemy state and having to flee south as fast as they possibly can. It would be terribly interesting should the wall, the partition ever be lifted. Would be very interesting to see what kind of Christians emerge from that North Korea. But in South Korea, we've seen a huge flourishing of churches, Yonggi-cho, I mentioned earlier, and how they've continued to grow. Stanley mentions how the North Korean Kim Il-sung came from a Presbyterian family. Not quite sure how many, 1 or 2 generations back, I suppose. So there's some faith in there somewhere, perhaps. So in Korea, you've got this sense of how the Protestants, using language, using indigenous ministry, have managed to make themselves a part of the rebellion and the triumph over the invading Japanese and the occupying protectorate of Japan, and in being part of that, shown how they are trustworthy and reliable. They're not Westerners, they are indigenous, and they're part of the people. And so they've shown themselves to be a key part of national identity. Now to Poland, and that's why we're coming closer and closer to this icon. So here we are. Whereas in most of Europe, bottom of page 15, in most of Europe, the second half of the century witnessed a sustained erosion of popular adherence to the churches. In Poland, the Roman Catholic Church continued to grow. Now, here we have something where we have some statistics that mess with your head about what counts as a proper Christian, and we'll find more of that as we go through this course. So do expect that to mess with you. But you've got this interesting statistic here. By the 1990s, you've got less than 50% regular practicing Christian, but you've got 79% who are quite happy to say, yes, there is a God who became a man. But they don't count as regular practicing Catholics. And you can contrast that with statistics for Ireland and for France, and so Poland is has got this deep-seated belief that's more than. Now, one of the reasons why it's more than is because a couple of treaties in 1921, 1945 moved the boundaries, resulting in the population of Poland being more Roman Catholic. But whilst you've got a worldwide decline in Catholic priesthood, you don't have that in Poland. And instead, we see a steady increase. And a lot of that increase can be credited to the Blessed Virgin Mary. We love her. You gotta love her. And so here, in Stanley says, Polish nationalism, like much other nationalism, rests on the identification and commemoration of certain episodes in the past as symbolically constitutive of the identity of the nation. Top of page 16 here that I'm looking at. So somehow or other, the BVM has this special place in the heart of Polish people. And there are three key moments that that Stanley picks up on that he considers to be pivotal to Polish history, Polish identity. They don't quite come in chronological order. Kind of do, but kind of don't. You start off with the baptism of Mieszko, and so he is the chief of the Slav tribe 966. And so, if you like, this is the beginning of a Polish identity. So you get to 1966. That's going to be a millennium since 966. I'm sure you could do the maths yourself. And Cardinal Primate Stefan, oh help me, Wyszynski. He's released from house arrest. I'm coming to that bit in a moment. And so he starts a 9-year visit to each parish. Get yourself ready for 1966. And so there's this big understanding of the baptism of Mieszko and this Poland's millennium combined with the nation is with the church. Key first point. Key second point is this cardinal, as he goes around, he goes with a replica of the Byzantine icon of the Black Madonna of Jasna Gora near Czestochowa. Now, the Madonna is black from all the smoke damage that's come from years of veneration. So this icon is from 1382, and it's got this backstory. Jasna Gora in 1655 successfully defends itself against invasion, and the success is attributed to the Madonna of Jasna Gora. And so the King of Poland declares her to be the Queen of Poland. She becomes the mother and the bride of the nation. By the 12th century, you've got this accepted understanding of the Blessed Virgin Mary as having her bodily assumption. This is the doctrine of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that the Pope, in his one time of using the I'm infallible card in the 1960s, it's the only time I believe him to have actually said, now I'm being infallible when I say this, BVM, she got assumed, the Assumption, that's already doing the rounds in the 12th century. So when the Pope says it, or kind of all those who are in favor of it are already going, yeah, well, we're in favor of it, it's no big deal. So there's already that sense of devotion. 1920, there's this miracle of Vistula when the Poles defeated the godless Bolsheviks, and so the BVM gets attributed. The success of the miracle of Vistula is attributed to the BVM, the success over the Bolsheviks troops. So when Cardinal Primate Stefan, gotta practice this one, Wyszynski, Cardinal Wyszynski is processing around with a replica of this. The authorities come and arrest the icon, and so they remove the icon, and instead the procession continues, but just with an empty procession with no actual icon on it, but nonetheless they are still processing anyway. And I think somehow the regime was shamed into returning the icon, and on with the procession we go. You've got to somehow or other I don't know, laugh at the wonder of this. I think it's brilliant. And then you've got the murder of Bishop Stanislaw. He's the first bishop of Krakow. So 1079, he's canonized, made a saint, 1253, and becomes the patron saint of Poles. And here he's the man who embodies this sense of suffering, and through that becomes part of the identity of Poland. They're familiar with this idea of suffering and yet coming through all that suffering. And so we see that in the archetypal in understanding of Polish aviators in the Battle of Britain and things like the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. So then you come to 1978 and you've got a Polish priest, a Polish Pope, John Paul II. How exciting is that? Coinciding with the 900th anniversary of the Polish saint in Stanislaw. And the Pope comes and visits in 1979. More than 30 million Poles come out to see the Pope in person, and obviously lots of tuning in on radio. And so you've got this unity in that the Pope is the Polish Pope is bringing as he comes to the people, and this leads on to Solidarnosc, led by Lech Walesa, and finally this results in Solidarity being signed, Solidarity Union. And I didn't realize this, but Lech Walesa, he signs this using a Pope souvenir pen as part of it. There's a very deliberate moment going on here. I love this change of dates that's tucked away in here. The Communist Party date on October the 12th, and it gets transferred to August the 15th. I think it's still called Polish Armed Forces Day, but nonetheless, August the 15th is the feast of the Assumption of the BVM, and it's also the anniversary of the miracle of Vistula, and so it's very clearly a sign of the nation's identity that's celebrating both a national holiday and a deeply Christian holiday. Christianity and nationalism, then, uneasy bedfellows. In Korea, Protestantism drew Koreans together against Japan. In Poland, the Marian devotion focused a national identity against Nazism, and so pushing out Nazism, and against communism, and so finally dealing with that. But nationalism remains quite dangerous. It feeds off those who are perceived as enemies of the nation, whereas Christianity calls us to love our enemies. Now, in Poland, this could have degenerated into xenophobia, racism, and was associated with anti-Semitism. I suggest there's still parts of it that still are, but there you are. I'm going to stop now because I feel like I'm enjoying this too much. But I think I'd love us to explore more. I'd love to learn more about nationalism and Christianity and how the two work together. Certainly, we can explore it for this country as well. But that'll do for tonight.